Okay, so in this video, we're going to go over some of the basic selection tools here in Photoshop. And I've created just a document here with a few things in it, just from some of um, the shape patterns and stuff. And we can see that I have three layers going here, which I'll get into layers here in the next video. I mean, we'll go over some of the particulars here, but I'll do another video specifically on the properties of layers. But just for these selection tools, let's go ahead and go through a few things here. So I'm on the Move tool, or V, for those of you that don't know that hotkey there. And you'll notice as I click around on each one of these things in the back, the blue layer there, you can see that you see that these are jumping around depending on which one I click on. Now, that's because I have this auto select checked right here. If I uncheck that, then notice as I'm clicking around now, the layers don't change. Right? So that keeps me fixed on a layer. And if I wanted to get to this paw print layer, for example, I would have to come in here and click on layer 3, and then I would be on this active layer. Or the alternative is I could, if I hold Command and then click, you'll see that the layers change around as well. Right? So holding Command if I don't have that auto select feature on. And then let's go ahead and just turn it back on. So it can work great when you have a limited number of layers and it's easy to get around with them. But if you had, for example, I don't know, 30 or 40 layers, you might not want to have auto select on. It can be a little bit of a pain to navigate through layers, but we can get to that. And yeah, so that's the Move tool. So as I click and hold, I can move, I can move things around accordingly pretty easily. Okay, so let's go down here to the marquee tool, the rectangular marquee tool, and we'll just click on that. And if we click and hold, you'll see it opens up these other options here, and I'll go through those briefly after this. But so we have our rectangular marquee tool, and essentially whatever layer I'm on is that active layer. So whichever layer I'm on is going to be wherever I'm making that selection. So I'm just clicking on layer 3 since that's the top layer right now. And if I just click and drag, it's going to create a rectangular selection for me. Now this isn't constrained right now. I can move this around and it can elongate it or widen it. While I'm still holding down, if I hold down Shift, that'll bring it into a proper 1-to-1 ratio, and that will scale out accordingly for a precise square that's equal in all dimensions. But if I let go of Shift, I can then free constrain it and move it around as well. If you notice up on your toolbar up here, we have some options. So this right here is our standard just marquee selection tool, makes a new selection. And then we have add to selection and subtract to selection. So if I click on this add to selection, if I draw another rectangle out here, we'll see that it combined and it made for a larger selection. Right? It's basically just adding to whatever I've selected. I can come up here and I can click on the subtract, and now I can come into my selection by clicking and dragging, and right, I can come in and even take out, if I wanted to take out holes, right, and not select certain areas inside, I can do that as well. There's some nice shortcut hotkeys for this. So right now, if you notice, there's a little minus sign next to my crosshairs. That's because I'm on the subtract from, but let's go ahead and put it back on the regular. So I'm back on regular, and if I hold down Shift, you see that little plus sign that comes up next to the cursor. Shift right there, and then Option or Alt, if you're on PC, will bring up that minus sign. So if I hold Shift and make a selection, it will add to. If I hold Option or Alt on a PC and do it, it will subtract from. So this will become really important, as we're learning Photoshop. These shortcut keys can be really helpful. So yeah, that's adding to and subtracting from. And then this one right here is the intersection of a selection. So I don't use this one too much, but I'll just show you what it does. So this will emphasize the intersection of the two. So once I let go of this, everything is going to disappear except for the intersection of these two, which is right here in the center. Again, so I don't use that one too much, but that's what it does. Go ahead and click back on New Selection again. And then anytime you want to get rid of a selection, it's Command D, and that will take that away. So if I have a selection, and if it's not going away, you'll notice, you can be clicking around, and that will basically stay there. I can switch to other tools, and that'll stay there until I Command D and get rid of that. So go back to Marquee tool, rectangular marquee tool, and let's say I'm going to make a selection here, and we see the feather right here. This is basically telling me how soft of an edge I want to have around this. So if I were to move up to the top layer. So if I go to make that selection, and then I go to my paint bucket tool, and then I fill it, right? That's what, and then Command D to get rid of it. That's what that edge would look like. Now if I come back to my marquee tool, and let's say I go, let's do 5. Okay, and my paint bucket tool was G, and then I fill that in, and then Command D will take that away, and then we can see that feathered edge, right? Okay, so let's Command Z, I'll delete that, and we'll come back here. And a couple other things when you're making your selection. So if I have my rectangle, you see how it's bringing that out from the top left corner of the square. Let's say I wanted to make that come out from a different place. If I wanted to grow that from the center rather than that top left corner, I could just hold Option and then click, and then that brings it open from that center. Now I could also, let me Command D and get rid of that. I could also hold Option Shift, and that will give it that fixed ratio from a center point. Right? Okay. So the same things apply for the elliptical marquee tool, the exact same things. We have the same add to, subtract from, or the inverse and feather. And again, so the ellipse is if we're just having a free movement, not constraining it at all. If I were to hold Shift, that gives me the circle. Okay. And then single row marquee, vertical or horizontal. This is essentially just picking one line of pixels, one row of pixels, either horizontally or vertically. We'll have an exercise later on where I'll show you how this can be handy, but otherwise you don't really use this too much. But again, I'll show you. It can be helpful if you want to create a patterned grid. Okay, and then here's another selection tool, our Lasso tool, or L. Is just a freehand selection tool that you can make, and then once you've made that, you can move around. Okay, and let's go into the polygonal lasso tool, and this is built up with straight lines. The starting point will always be the last point that you clicked on, and then once you're ready, you can come back to the starting point, and you can see that circle appear on the bottom right of that icon, and then that will close that selection, and then you can move that around or do what you'd like there. Okay. Magnetic lasso tool, I'll get into that later on, but essentially Photoshop is going to guess where you are wanting to make those lines, and it will try to snap to what it thinks you're wanting it to get to, and then operates the same way. You can bring it back to that close. You could if you're not ready, if if you just hit enter from wherever you are, it will automatically close as well too, so you don't necessarily have to go back to that starting point. But if you don't, it's essentially going to make a straight line back to it. So, okay. And then these last two, we're going to go over more of these later on, but these two are really handy. So if we want the quick selection tool, there's usually options that you want to kind of modify up here, you know, how large your selection tool is going to be, right? Remember, if we want to open or close or increase the size or decrease the size, you can quickly do that with the open and close brackets here. But again, the quick selection tool, again, Photoshop is going to guess the selections that you're trying to make, and it does a pretty good job, but you can set certain parameters for that as well. And again, we'll go further into that at a later time. But then Magic Wand will do the same thing. If I click, for example, here, Photoshop is guessing that I want to select that form there. Now we can see if I'll select another layer here. If I'm on the Magic Wand tool, I can click on that object and Photoshop will essentially guess what I'm selecting there, but a lot of that will come down to settings like the tolerance here. The larger the tolerance, the more inclusive your selection will be, because it's looking at the colors that are close to the hue that you're selecting. So the lower the tolerance, the more restrictive, or the more it's going to select like colors. But since we have hard edges on all these images here, you can get away with a lower tolerance. Last thing I want to show you here when it comes to the selection tools is, let's go back to the rectangular marquee tool, and let me put myself on, I'm on this checkered layer here, and let's go ahead and I'm going to select my brush tool and see what happens when I make some marks. Now notice I'm drawing on top of the blue and I'm drawing on top of my grid, but now when I come up to the paw print and the fleur-de-lis, you see the mark doesn't overlap because this layer is underneath these two, right? So you have to always think top down with layers, right? So if I'm making this mark, it's only going to affect the layer that I'm on and the layers that are below it. So now again, if I select this blue layer, right? So now I'm on that bottom layer, and now if I make this mark, if I try to paint, and if I go over my grid now, because I'm on the layer underneath it, the mark is behind it, right? And then if I want the mark to be on top of everything, I'll go onto layer 3, which is my top layer. And then now, every mark I do would be on top of everything. Okay? So that's one way to control what you're doing on your layers, but then the whole purpose of what I've been showing you is how we can get even more control. So let's say now I take my marquee tool and I make my selection, and I'm on the third layer, so I'm on the top layer. But now if I click out, so if I go back to my brush tool with B, if I go back to my brush tool and I click here, I'm painting, but nothing is happening because the selected layer is the only thing that will reveal my marks, right? So I can get even more specific, right? And then if I Command D, that goes away. So I could make another selection layer. So M, I'll do it around this paw print here. And again, my brush tool B, I'm clicking, I'm holding, even back on that part that I was just on, nothing is showing through, but as soon as I come down into this area, my brush strokes appear. There we go, and then I can Command D to get rid of that. Oop. Command D. That gets rid of what we call marching ants, right? The selection tool line that was outlining that section there. Okay, so that's a quick introduction into selection tools. Obviously, the further we get and the more expansive our projects get, I'll show us more and more particular ways and little cheats on how we can use these selection tools, but this should get us started going into this week's exercise. And I'll continue next with some more on layering and layer properties.